Okay, so welcome back to the talk on original oratory. The talk on oratory. No. Okay, so we're gonna move past that. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was, and just keep this in mind, if you're already at this level, again, I would say trust in your writing, trust in your process, and edit as needed. I would say if you found maybe a different example that you wanted to use, or something different, but you don't have to rebuild or reinvent the wheel just because you're at these championship tournaments. Okay, that's always something. Trust with what you got there. Okay, when we're talking about performance, I think one of the things that we really want to do is we want to make sure that it's well balanced. Again, when we say make them laugh, when I say make them laugh, Noreen, what did you take that as when you were in order, and what kind of advice can you give?
Okay, well, I think we should probably start by talking about the fact that everyone's humor is different, right?
Correct.
So I think one thing that oftentimes, even as coaches, we kind of find ourselves pushing almost the same humor onto
Mm-hmm.
our kids or expecting them to be at this level of humor or
Mm-hmm.
humorous. And I think, especially as a student, I kind of even had to accept that I'm not the most funny person. So,
She's not.
yeah, I'm definitely not. So when it came to having to make sure that I had that humorous aspect in my speech. Definitely, I for sure made sure that my jokes were catered to me and my type of humor, which was definitely sarcastic and a little witty and a little, snarky, if you will. But I worked on it and I made sure that with every joke I was working the room and it was fresh. But you just have to remember, and especially as a student, I had to remind myself that even if my judge doesn't have the same humor style as I do, all I have to do is do my part, and do my part of making them funny in my own style, and just kind of let it work out from there.
And that's also really important. What Noreen kind of pointed out was this idea of work, work what's yours. Work your work what works for you. If you are sarcastic, if you are kind of goofy with your humor, or if you're over the top with your humor, work that. Because remember, this isn't like an interpretation where it's a drama or a humor where you're going to be behind a character. You're actually going to be giving a speech. So the only character you're really trying to sell is yourself. So be yourself if that works. Because sometimes what happens is, we'll get into the writing, or like we're trying to, maybe add some different jokes for these championship tournaments. What ends up happening is all of a sudden you get kids who are like with requests. Well, can I be more like this particular person, or something I saw on a national final round tape? And if they're throwing a joke out there that really doesn't work for them, again, it has to be genuine. If anything, it has to be yourself. It has to be authentic. It has to be the authentic student. So coaches, as you're pushing them, the to a level of authenticity that can be real, that's what I think people really connect with in oratory is authenticity. So your humor should be what works for you, right?
Definitely.
Cool. So then, moving on from there, what would you say about making them think? Like how did you approach it when like we used to talk about that having to make them think?
I think personally, and I'm sure you would agree, out of the three aspects, that was probably where I struggled the most. I think sophistication, and that's really what's needed when it comes to that aspect of making them think. Sophistication, once again, looks different for everyone. And for me, considering that, like Tony was saying, I was more of a power speaker. So as far as sophistication, I had to really work on finding the different levels because, of course, you can't just be at one note when you're teaching and trying to make them think. And another thing that I always had to keep in mind was just really being present every time that I spoke. And I had to really remember that I'm teaching people who have never heard my speech, who are really listening with open ears, even though for me, and as a student, and especially at this time of the year, you've heard it a million times, you've said it to a bunch of different people, you've already qualified to these national tournaments, and you're kind of thinking to yourself, well, who's really listening? But as a student, I had to be reminded by my coaches, like, people are still listening, and people still want to be challenged and they want to think. So I was challenged with always being present and always making sure that with every single sentence that I was saying, I was challenging my audience to think and to be with me with every word. And one thing that especially as a coach now that I've learned is how you or what you're saying, like content wise, word for word, is super duper important, 100%. Well, what's almost slightly more important is how you're saying it.
Right.
Because let's say I have a statistic, right, and or just information that I'm really trying to give in my oratory, right? How I say it will really more guide the audience on how they'll feel about it. So like, let's say I have a statistic that says like 1 in 5 girls experience having to leave early from school due to like the inaccessibility to like menstrual products, right? Instead of me just saying it straightforward, I was challenged to always find new levels into how I would say it so that it would guide how my audience was feeling. So instead of just saying it straightforward, it's more of, and in fact, according to whatever source, 1 in 5 girls are required to leave. So it's really, like I'm saying, like it's really just about how you're saying what you're saying. And of course, it goes hand in hand, but it's really important to really come with that emotion, even, or just like that challenge in how you're speaking, so that we feel the purpose and the impact behind the information that it is that you're saying.
Exactly. So you're talking about impact. So that's the one thing about your logic. I mean, obviously, you're going to want to make sure that whatever claims or that you have a warrant behind it. And what do we mean by that is there's a piece of evidence, or again, because people get moved by numbers, people get moved by statistics, and more than anything, that's the one thing when you're making them think is that it's that teaching aspect. Good orators speak well. Great orators teach. So that's what we want, is we want you to teach us through the logic here, okay? And that's why it's always important when it comes to statistics, articles that you can use, quotes that people would kind of be familiar with, things that can give you credibility. Because again, this is, when you're talking about the logic of your oratory, that's where the credibility is at. And that's one of the things, is that you want to make sure that it's, again, balanced throughout all 3 parts of your oratory, or all 3 points, or depending on what you decide to do. But more than anything, I would say, again, in that aspect of making them think, you have to teach us. Okay? There has to be that point. Because again, if I can teach you something that you didn't know before, can I move you off that needle to persuade you? Okay? Because again, the big deal about oratory is it's supposed to be a speech to persuade. There should be that level of persuasion. Because if I'm not trying to persuade you, again, and I've always told my students, are you making statements, or are you going to make a point? Right? And that's always key. Because sometimes while we're performing oratory, it can get a little robotic, especially when it's towards the end of the year. We've been doing it for so long. Am I making a statement, or am I trying to make my point? Right? Which kind of also moves us then into our third aspect, right? How do we make them feel? Noreen, what do you think?
There's so much that we can go into as far as making them feel. So I know earlier we were talking about making sure that all of, of course, like at this point, it's kind of easy to assume that whatever topic that your student is doing, they're very passionate about, right? So I think one thing, especially at this point in the year, and with all of our students, we end up kind of falling into well, I've done this all the, for this entire year, so of course, like I still have the passion and I still have the feeling, but oftentimes that genuineness that was once there like months ago isn't there at this time of the year, right? And of course, at these tournaments that we are now competing at on the national level, it's more important than ever before. So I think the challenge is always, so one thing that Tony has always taught me, and that I always picked up as a student, is that your speech, no matter what point you are in the speech, your emotion and how you are as far as your tone, it's always going up and it's going down. It's not a jagged thing, so you're not jumping from emotion to emotion and jumping from aspect to aspect, but it's a flow. It's a constant flow. It's not just one little plot diagram. It's a constant flow, up and down, right? And your job is essentially to take us on this journey, right? But at the main point of the journey is just the why, right? So of course, I think in every single speech, everybody has an emotional part in it, at least one, in some place. Sometimes people have them in multiple places. And sometimes we don't even realize as students that we have emotion in some aspects. And I think it's really about being present, and it's really about encouraging your students to think, to rethink, and to kind of circle back almost to the first time of like when they first started memorizing the speech, of how a person should feel from listening to what it is that you're saying. So yeah, just remind yourself, it's about reminding yourself as a student of what the purpose is, what your audience is supposed to be walking away with, and just really making us think, and just,
Because what's important about this particular one, and Noreen would agree with me on this, is that the humor, anybody can make somebody laugh. Logic, we can challenge People can always think. But making your judge walk away because you made them feel something, that's going to make your judge remember, wow. But at the same time, what I would caution is this, because don't forget, your judge is going to be in around 6 or 7 oratories, right? So a lot of, and this isn't to take away from those stories, but a lot of stories in oratory always end in death, whether it's suicide, somebody getting murdered, or some trauma that's happening to try to make our point. So one of the things I would say is those stories are good, whether they're a heart story or as we like to refer to them as kickers too. But what's really important is this: don't try to create the drama in your performance. Extol, pull out that empathy. Because if your judge, we just don't want your judge feeling bad for your story, or no, what we want them is we want them to experience that same kind of feel that you felt. And just like Noreen had pointed out, go back to your first love. Again, have your students go back to, and always remember that. Because how do we, again, there's a great song by Earth, Wind, and Fire, After the Love Is Gone, right? And how many times have you do your speeches so many times and so many different ways that sometimes that love is gone. So what do? Well, we have to go back to it. We have to go back and understand what it is and what motivated us to write this speech. And it's usually not humor, it's usually not the logic, it's going to be the emotion, right? So when you're making that impact and you're making that emotional connection, remember, it's not about extolling, I should say, it's not about being dramatic. It's not about, again, making it over dramatic to make that impact. No, it's about connecting with your judge. And that's one of the things that I would also say is that sometimes when people perform, especially in particular with their dramatic moments, one of the things I kind of notice is that they'll look away from the camera or they'll look away from their judge and they don't try to connect. And one of the things that I've always said is that when you're in that moment, when you're in that emotional appeal, connect with your judge. Not on some deep level that, like, oh my God, like you've been friends for 10 years, because obviously that's not going to happen. But extol that empathy because we're all human at some point. And particularly in the virtual world, in the virtual world, one of the things I would also kind of say is, again, due to COVID-19 and because of our virtual tournament status, we've had to go from stage actors or stage performers to screen actors. So you want to pop off the stage, but also keep in mind, that's where the humor comes in. That's where the teaching comes in, and that's where the emotion comes in, because we want to pop off the screen, but we want to keep our judges engaged. Because I've done it too. All of a sudden, you're judging around on your laptop, and all of a sudden the doorbell rings. Or all of a sudden you start looking at your refrigerator if you're by your kitchen, or other things in your house, you start getting distracted. So the way we keep people engaged is by doing what? We keep people engaged by trying to extol empathy, trying to connect to their human core, more than anything. Because honestly, like I said, after 6 or 7, speeches, and if all of them end in trauma, if all of them are about suicide, and not that we're discounting any of those stories because they're all precious in their own way, but in the same way, how are we trying to connect through our message? Because again, at the same time, and that's why we talk about topics sometimes is, even though I was really impassioned about my topic the first time, how can I use my passion to connect, make that impact on my judge? Does it have to be groundbreaking? No. Does it have to be life-altering? No. But if we can take something away, and that's the thing behind making them laugh, making them think, making them feel, you need to have something that your judges can walk away with. Because if you don't, then guess what? Instead of you getting, first, second, or third, now you're in the 4th or 5th. As much as, again, so that's why we would say is mass appeal. When you're looking at the oratory and you're trying to prep for these big tournaments, do I have those 3 things? Am I going to make them laugh? And it's not falling out of the chair laughing, but making them smile, right? Do I have logic? But do I have logic that's going to make my argument? What's the best form of the argument in my oratory? And am I teaching through that argument? Because it's just not about, again, you making your claim and going, okay, boom, here's what I'm doing. If I can't connect on somebody in a real world, if I can't connect with my logic or with some of my supporting evidence, then what am I doing? Again, one of the things I always tell my students, and Noreen will remember this, hearing this, and sometimes she'll be like, okay, that's enough already. But I always just say, make your sources work for you. So when you're looking at small edits, or take a look at the sources, do these sources make an impact to what's going on in my speech? To the point that I can make my appeal to extol that empathy, because everything sets everything up, right? My humor is going to set up what? My logic, right? It's going to give me that opportunity to do what? Set up my argument so people will want to listen to me. But once I set up my argument, what's the knockout blow? It's that little tug on the heart. You get what I'm saying? Right? It's that little tug on the heart. It's about being able to connect to people and pull that empathy out so that at the end of it, you know what? We're sitting back going, again, and asking ourselves this question. Where in this child's soul, as a judge, we're asking this question, where in this child's soul did this oratory come from? Because those are the oratory topics that will make it to the stage. Those are the oratory topics that, guess what, get remembered. Those are the oratory topics where they're talking about, hey, I remember this national final round in 2016 and there was a student. Those are the ones that will always be remembered. And those are the ones that will last forever in the minds of judges, coaches, and other students. Okay?